On the morning of March 25, 2009, in Grovetown, Georgia, an urgent call was placed to emergency services by a handyman named Mitchell Cart. Cart had been scheduled to perform some repair work at the home of 41-year-old Kay Parsons, a well-liked woman who lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood. However, when he arrived, something immediately seemed off. The back door was slightly open, and there were clear signs of forced entry, splintered wood, and a broken lock. Uneasy, Cart hesitated before stepping inside. Instead, his instincts told him to call the police, fearing that a crime had taken place. Within minutes, officers arrived at the scene, ready to investigate what they initially assumed was a routine burglary. The officers carefully entered the home, scanning for any signs of the homeowner. The house was in chaos. Drawers yanked open, furniture overturned, and various items strewn across the floor. It looked like the work of a desperate burglar, but something didn't sit right. Moving cautiously through the house, the officers reached the garage, where they were met with a gruesome sight. Kay Parsons lay unconscious on the cold concrete floor, her body covered in blood. Nearby, two weapons, a bloodied baseball bat and a crowbar, suggested the sheer brutality of the attack. Miraculously, she was still alive, her breath faint and her pulse weak. Officers immediately called for an ambulance, knowing that every second counted. Kay Parsons was rushed to the hospital, where doctors fought to save her life. The severity of her injuries was staggering. Her skull had been crushed, and she had suffered catastrophic brain trauma. The attack was so violent that doctors quickly realized there was little hope of recovery. Though she was placed on life support, the prognosis was grim. Meanwhile, detectives worked quickly to piece together what had happened. The level of violence suggested this was more than just a burglary gone wrong. Someone had wanted Kay dead, and they had gone to extreme lengths to ensure it. But who would do such a thing? As investigators processed the crime scene, another shocking twist emerged. Kay's next-door neighbor, Rebecca Sears, had also reported a break-in at her home around the same time. The Sears house, just steps away from the Parsons residence, showed similar signs of a forced entry. Drawers were pulled open, and valuables were missing. At first glance, it seemed like the work of a serial burglar targeting homes in the neighborhood. However, investigators found something that changed the direction of the case entirely. Blood smears on the back door of the Sears home, later identified as Kay Parsons' blood. This raised a troubling question. Had the same person attacked both homes, or was there a deeper connection between the two families? Kay Parsons was known as a devoted wife and mother. She lived in the home with her husband, David Parsons, and their teenage son, Derek. On the morning of the attack, David had been out of state on a business trip, while Kay had just returned home after dropping Derek off at school. By all accounts, she had no enemies, and lived a relatively quiet suburban life. However, investigators knew that crimes of this nature were rarely random. Someone had specifically targeted Kay, and the connection between her and the break-in at Rebecca Sears' house suggested that the truth might be closer to home than anyone had initially suspected. As detectives continued their investigation, they began looking into Kay Parsons' relationships and the people around her. One name quickly stood out: her next-door neighbor, Rebecca Sears. The two women had been friends, but investigators sensed there was something more beneath the surface. Suspicion grew when detectives discovered that Rebecca had a criminal past, including charges of fraud and theft. While this didn't necessarily mean she was involved in the attack, it raised questions about her reported break-in and whether it was genuinely a coincidence. When police questioned Rebecca about her movements that morning, her story seemed rehearsed and inconsistent. This only fueled the investigators' suspicions. Was Rebecca Sears somehow connected to the brutal attack on Kay? As detectives dug deeper, they made another startling discovery. Rebecca Sears had a 19-year-old son named Christopher Bowers who lived with her. Christopher had a troubled past and had struggled with financial issues. When police began questioning people in the neighborhood, several residents mentioned seeing Christopher around the time of the attack, but his whereabouts were unclear. Investigators also learned that Rebecca and Christopher had an unusually close relationship, one that raised eyebrows even among those who knew them well. What's more, Rebecca had recently taken out a substantial life insurance policy, leading detectives to wonder if money had played a role in the crime. A major breakthrough came when police received a tip from a source close to the Sears family. The informant claimed that Rebecca and Christopher had been discussing plans to get rid of Kay Parsons days before the attack. This tip led detectives to re-examine the scene of the crime, where they discovered a crucial piece of evidence, a set of bloody shoe prints leading from Kay's garage toward Rebecca's home. The prints were a perfect match to shoes found in Christopher's room. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but investigators needed one final confirmation: someone willing to testify against Rebecca and Christopher. With the brutal crime scene at the Parsons home still under forensic examination, investigators were working tirelessly to piece together what had happened. The initial theory suggested a botched burglary, but the overwhelming violence inflicted on Kay Parsons made it clear that this was far more than a simple break-in gone wrong. Her injuries indicated an attack fueled by deep rage rather than a random act of violence. As detectives dug deeper, they discovered something even more bizarre. Another burglary had taken place at the Sears residence just next door. This revelation changed everything. The Sears family, like the Parsons, was well respected in the neighborhood, making it unlikely that these two break-ins were coincidental. More importantly, forensic analysis uncovered faint smears of Kay's blood on the back door of the Sears home. This crucial piece of evidence suggested that the same individual who attacked Kay had also entered the neighboring house. But why? Had they been searching for something specific? Was it an attempt to mislead investigators? These questions loomed over the case as detectives sought to find connections between the two families. The first person police questioned in the Sears household was Rebecca Sears. Upon hearing the news of Kay's attack, Rebecca was visibly shaken. She immediately rushed to the hospital, desperate to see her closest friend. As she spoke with detectives, she seemed genuinely distraught, repeatedly asking about Kay's condition. Meanwhile, Kay's husband, David Parsons, who had been away on a business trip in California, was informed of the tragedy. He took the first available flight home, devastated by the news. The investigation soon led detectives to Rebecca's son, Michael, a 16-year-old with a troubled history. A handyman named Mitchell Cart, who had discovered the crime scene, recalled seeing Michael sitting on a rock across the street, watching as the authorities arrived. This strange behavior made investigators suspicious. When they questioned Michael, they noticed something odd: a small fragment of frosted glass lodged in the tread of his shoe. This glass matched the broken window of the Parsons' back door, placing him at the crime scene. Despite this discovery, there was no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA that directly linked Michael to the attack. When questioned, Michael denied any involvement. He claimed he had been waiting for a friend, a fellow drug user who was supposed to meet him. While investigators had their doubts, they lacked the concrete evidence needed to arrest him. However, their suspicions remained. As law enforcement worked through the evidence, the case took a dramatic turn. Rebecca Sears called 911, claiming that someone had tried to kill her. According to her, she had been walking home when an unknown assailant emerged from the woods and fired a shot at her before fleeing. Though the attack sounded alarming, the details raised suspicions. The bullet had only grazed her leg, barely breaking the skin. If someone had truly intended to kill her, why had they missed at such close range? And why had the attacker immediately fled the scene? Rebecca later told police that the assailant had demanded money from her, warning that if she didn't pay, he would kill her next time. This claim added another layer of confusion to an already perplexing case. Investigators now had to consider whether this was connected to Kay's murder, or if it was a separate incident entirely. Detectives turned their focus back to Rebecca's sons, Michael and his older brother, Christopher Sears. Michael had already been under suspicion, but now they wanted to know more about Christopher. While Michael was known to be troubled, Christopher had a different reputation. He was intelligent, ambitious, and seemed to have his life together. He was attending a prestigious university, had his own apartment, and was financially supported by his mother. But, as detectives soon discovered, Christopher's relationship with his mother was far from ordinary. During their questioning, Christopher denied any knowledge of the break-ins or his mother's attack. However, a new witness soon emerged, bringing forth shocking allegations. Jerry Jacobs, Rebecca's own brother, was serving time in the county jail for a DUI offense when he saw news reports about the case. He immediately contacted detectives, claiming to have vital information. According to Jerry, Rebecca had been having an affair with none other than David Parsons, Kay's husband. This revelation turned the entire investigation upside down. Jerry explained that Rebecca had confessed to him about her affair months earlier, and she had become obsessed with David. She had even admitted the affair to her husband, Tony Sears, which led him to file for divorce. Jerry went on to claim that Rebecca had begged him for help in getting rid of Kay, hoping to make it look like an accident. When he refused, she had pressured him to find someone else who would do it for money. This shocking claim meant that Kay's murder might not have been a crime of opportunity, but a carefully orchestrated plot. The next step for investigators was to confront David Parsons. When questioned, David Parsons did not deny the affair. He admitted that he and Rebecca had been involved for months, meeting in secret whenever their spouses were away. However, he strongly denied any role in his wife's murder. According to David, he had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Rebecca's behavior. After she confessed their affair to her husband and filed for divorce, he realized she was becoming reckless. He had no intention of leaving his wife, and he had ended the affair shortly before the attack on Kay. Despite his confession, David had an airtight alibi. He was in California at the time of the murder. Investigators had no evidence to suggest he had orchestrated the crime from afar. However, his statements led detectives to a new person of interest, Christopher Sears. Jerry Jacobs had told police that Rebecca had been calling Christopher frequently, crying about her situation and begging him to take care of the problem. She had repeatedly implied that Kay needed to be removed from the picture. While Christopher had never directly agreed, he also never refused. Instead, he reassured his mother that he would handle it. Investigators soon uncovered another disturbing detail. Rebecca had been supplying Christopher with prescription painkillers, which she had access to through her job at a physical therapy center. This raised concerns about whether she had been using drugs to maintain control over him. When detectives confronted Rebecca, they presented her with a grim reality. She was facing life in prison, or worse, the death penalty. Under pressure, she finally broke down. However, instead of taking responsibility, she turned on her own son. In a desperate attempt to save herself, Rebecca claimed that she had never meant for anything to happen to Kay. She insisted that Christopher had misinterpreted her words and taken matters into his own hands. According to Rebecca, she had pleaded with him not to do anything rash, but he had refused to listen. Rebecca then provided investigators with a crucial lead. She knew where the stolen valuables and Christopher's bloodied clothes were hidden. She directed them to a cabin outside the city where a box containing the evidence had been stashed in the attic. Forensic testing confirmed that the clothes contained Kay's blood, along with Christopher's fingerprints. At this point, the truth became undeniable. Christopher had carried out the attack, and Rebecca had been involved in planning it. The final pieces of the puzzle revealed that on the morning of the murder, Rebecca had driven Christopher to her home, knowing he planned to break into the Parsons' house. After she left to take her younger children to school, Christopher forced his way inside and ambushed Kay when she arrived home. He brutally beat her with a crowbar and a baseball bat before staging the house to look like a burglary. Once the crime was complete, Christopher ransacked his own home to make it seem like both houses had been targeted. Later, Rebecca helped him dispose of evidence. As the case moved to trial, Rebecca's manipulative nature became even more apparent. In court, she attempted to shift all the blame onto Christopher, even writing him letters begging him not to resent her. However, the jury saw through her deception. Both Rebecca and Christopher were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the end, Rebecca's obsession destroyed not only her own life, but also the lives of everyone around her. Kay Parsons lost her life in a senseless act of violence. Christopher threw his future away, and David was left to pick up the pieces of the mess his affair had caused. Following the shocking arrests of Rebecca Sears and her son, Christopher Sears, the community was left in disbelief. Many who had known Rebecca as a friendly and hardworking mother struggled to reconcile her public persona with the horrific crime she had orchestrated. As the news spread, neighbors who had once welcomed her into their homes now viewed her with fear and disgust. Meanwhile, Christopher's friends and former teachers were stunned that the intelligent young man they had known was capable of such brutality. As investigators delved deeper into Rebecca's background, they discovered a pattern of manipulation that extended far beyond her affair with David Parsons. She had a history of using people to get what she wanted, whether it was money, affection, or control. Her relationships were often marked by emotional manipulation, and those close to her described her as someone who could be charming when she needed to be, but cold and ruthless when things didn't go her way. Despite her initial attempts to pin the blame entirely on Christopher, the evidence against Rebecca was overwhelming. Not only had she helped plan the attack, but she had also aided in covering it up. Phone records showed that she had made several calls to Christopher on the day of the murder, and surveillance footage captured her stopping by an ATM near the crime scene, presumably to withdraw money for her son's getaway. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they faced a difficult decision: should they seek the death penalty? Given the calculated nature of the crime and the devastating impact it had on Kay Parsons' family, many believed that both Rebecca and Christopher deserved the harshest possible punishment. However, prosecutors also knew that securing a death sentence would require a long and emotionally draining legal battle. While Rebecca remained in denial about the severity of her actions, Christopher's demeanor changed after his arrest. At first, he refused to speak to investigators, maintaining a stony silence. But as the reality of his situation sank in, he began to realize that his mother had set him up. She had encouraged him to commit the crime, promised to protect him, and then betrayed him the moment she was caught. Now, facing a lifetime behind bars, he was beginning to crack under the pressure. As Christopher sat in his jail cell, he struggled with feelings of guilt, regret, and anger toward his mother. He had always sought her approval, and, in his mind, helping her with Kay Parsons' murder had been a way to prove his loyalty. But now that loyalty had cost him everything. His promising future was gone, his name was forever tarnished, and the mother he had tried to please had turned against him to save herself. After weeks of silence, Christopher finally agreed to talk. In a tearful confession, he admitted to being the one who had attacked Kay Parsons, but he insisted that he never would have done it without his mother's influence. He described how Rebecca had manipulated him, convincing him that Kay was an obstacle that needed to be removed. She had made it sound as though they had no other choice, telling him that if Kay remained in the picture, their family would fall apart. Christopher detailed the events of that fateful day. He explained how he had waited for Kay to return home before ambushing her in the garage. He admitted that the attack had been far more brutal than he had anticipated. Kay had fought back, and in a moment of panic, he had struck her repeatedly with the crowbar. The rage and adrenaline had taken over, and by the time he stopped, she was barely alive. He also revealed a chilling detail. After the attack, he had called his mother. Instead of panicking or telling him to run, Rebecca had calmly instructed him on how to stage the crime scene. She had even advised him on what to steal from the house to make it look like a robbery. Then, after he had done everything she asked, she told him to return home and act normal. Christopher's confession was a turning point in the case. It provided prosecutors with the final piece of evidence they needed to ensure that both he and Rebecca would face the full consequences of their actions. However, it also raised a difficult question. Should Christopher be held just as accountable as his mother? While he was the one who had carried out the murder, it was clear that he had been under his mother's influence. As the trial approached, prosecutors had to decide whether to offer Christopher a plea deal in exchange for his testimony against Rebecca. The trial of Rebecca Sears and Christopher Sears was one of the most highly publicized cases in the region's history. Reporters filled the courtroom, eager to capture every detail of the shocking case. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture of a mother who had manipulated her own son into committing murder, while the defense argued that Christopher had acted on his own. Rebecca, dressed in a conservative suit, sat emotionless as the prosecution laid out the evidence against her. She refused to look at Christopher, who sat just a few feet away. Instead, she maintained her innocence, claiming that she had no idea Christopher planned to kill Kay and that she had been unfairly accused. However, Christopher's testimony shattered any hope she had of escaping justice. When he took the stand, he recounted in heartbreaking detail how his mother had influenced him. He described how she had cried to him, telling him that Kay was ruining her life. He told the jury about the night before the murder, when Rebecca had sat with him in the living room, holding his hand and telling him that he was the only one she could trust. "I thought I was helping her," Christopher said, his voice shaking. "I thought I was protecting my family." The prosecution also presented damning evidence, including phone records, text messages, and surveillance footage that linked Rebecca to the crime. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence was a recorded phone call between Rebecca and Christopher after their arrest. In the call, Rebecca coldly told her son that he needed to take responsibility like a man and stop trying to drag her down with him. The jury deliberated for just a few hours before reaching a verdict: guilty on all charges. When the verdict was announced, Rebecca showed no emotion. Christopher, on the other hand, broke down in tears. He had betrayed his own morals, thrown away his future, and lost everything for a mother who had never truly cared about him. During the sentencing phase, family members of Kay Parsons gave emotional victim impact statements. Kay's husband, David, spoke about the pain of losing his wife and the guilt he felt for ever being involved with Rebecca. Kay's sister described how their family had been shattered by the loss, and how they would never forgive Rebecca and Christopher for what they had done. Rebecca was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Christopher, because of his cooperation with the prosecution and his evident remorse, received a slightly lesser sentence: life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. In the end, justice was served, but the damage was irreversible. Kay Parsons was gone, her family was left to grieve, and 2 lives were wasted behind bars. The case served as a grim reminder of how manipulation, greed, and obsession could lead to devastating consequences. As the trial for Rebecca Sears and her son Christopher Sears commenced on April 22, 2009, the courtroom was filled with tension and anticipation. The case had drawn nationwide media attention as the shocking details of betrayal and murder continued to unfold. Prosecutors and defense attorneys fought fiercely, each trying to shift the blame onto the other defendant. Rebecca, accused of orchestrating the crime, presented herself as a grieving mother who had been misunderstood, while Christopher, the one who physically carried out the attack, argued that he had been manipulated into committing the brutal murder of Kay Parsons. The case was not just about justice for Kay, but also about unraveling the twisted relationship between Rebecca and her son. Throughout the trial, Rebecca's demeanor puzzled many. She attempted to appear emotional and affectionate toward Christopher, whispering, "I love you," and even blowing him kisses during court proceedings. However, those observing the trial found her behavior insincere and manipulative. believing that she was using maternal affection as a tool to sway public sympathy. Meanwhile, Christopher sat silently, showing little reaction to his mother's gestures. His once close bond with Rebecca had been shattered, and now they were adversaries in court. The prosecution presented a compelling case, backed by forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the shocking details of the crime scene. Blood-stained clothing, which Rebecca had helped hide in the attic of her parents' cabin, contained both Kay's blood and Christopher's DNA, proving that he had been inside the Parson home. Furthermore, Rebecca's own statements to law enforcement, where she tried to deflect blame onto her son, demonstrated her deep involvement in the planning and cover-up of the murder. Jerry Jacobs, Rebecca's brother, became a key witness for the prosecution. He testified that Rebecca had repeatedly asked him to find someone to kill Kay, making it clear that this crime had been premeditated. Additionally, investigators revealed that Rebecca had been supplying Christopher with prescription drugs, keeping him under her control. Phone records and messages showed how Rebecca had emotionally manipulated Christopher, repeatedly expressing her desperation over David Parsons and encouraging Christopher to take care of the problem. These revelations painted a damning picture of a mother who had exploited her son's vulnerabilities for her own selfish desires. Christopher's defense attorneys worked to shift the blame onto Rebecca, portraying him as a troubled young man who had been coerced into committing the crime. They argued that while Christopher had participated in the attack, it was only because he was under the emotional and psychological control of his mother. They emphasized how Rebecca had consistently reinforced her obsession with David Parsons, convincing Christopher that Kay's death was necessary for their future happiness. In an unexpected turn, 2 letters Rebecca had written to Christopher from jail were leaked to the press. In these letters, she pleaded with him not to resent her, professing her love and stating that she was so happy to see him in court. The letters, rather than evoking sympathy, further enraged the public. They seemed like an attempt at manipulation rather than genuine remorse. The jury saw Rebecca as a woman willing to betray even her own son to save herself. Meanwhile, Christopher, despite his involvement, appeared broken by the realization that his mother had used him as a pawn and then abandoned him when it suited her. After weeks of intense arguments and overwhelming evidence, the jury reached a verdict. Both Rebecca Sears and Christopher Sears were found guilty of premeditated murder, conspiracy, evidence tampering, and perjury. Christopher, additionally charged with burglary and theft, faced even more severe consequences. The court took Rebecca's cooperation into account, sparing her from the maximum penalty, but she was still sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Christopher received the same fate, sealing his future behind bars for a crime he had committed under his mother's influence. As the sentences were announced, Christopher seemed hollow, his face devoid of emotion. It was clear that the weight of his actions and the betrayal by his mother had completely crushed him. Rebecca, who had spent months shifting blame and playing the role of a victim, now faced the reality of life in prison, her elaborate schemes ultimately leading to her own downfall. In the end, Rebecca's obsession with David Parsons had not only destroyed her life, but also condemned her son, left young Derek Parsons without a mother, and brought disgrace upon both families. The case stood as a chilling example of how unchecked obsession and manipulation could lead to irreversible tragedy.